I think what I liked best about when Anthony invited me in and when Nick invited me in was that the openness of these spaces to conversation. For people who are engaged in community support, it often is a perpetual scramble. It's a lot of organizations with a lot of different contacts that need to change frequently. It's people who we are seeking to support. At the same time, the supports for us may or may not be in place. And what there often isn't space to do is simply to pause long enough to have a conversation about what we're doing. And not only the destination, the things we have to deliver, but the processes we engage in when we're working in these endeavors, which inevitably involve crossing lines and bringing together different groups in some fashion. And so what I'm hoping today will be is a space that allows for a conversation that is safe, as it's described in these conversations, and that is comfortable and is a space where somewhat risky things could be said, perhaps, that might not always feel safe to say in our general lives. And that often includes where we ourselves encounter difficulties. I watched the registration list as it developed because it was where to pitch the questions that I'm going to ask you. And by where to pitch, I mean, was it people who are only, let's say, and I don't mean only, but only like right on the front line, or was it people in more meso positions? I mean, we don't have CEOs in this group. We don't have the people who are writing the specs for whatever the grants are they're going to give out. But I think one thing we all have in common is we're in the middle. We are both seeking out the support of others who can supply us with resources, and we are seeking to support those who are within communities as well as working with them directly. And so we are continually crossing between a number of different conversations. Part of being involved in conversations is we pick up the language. We pick up how to do things with different groups of people. Or perhaps more accurately, we pick up how to do things and then we carry them across the communities we engage with. So the conversation we have A will carry into the way we're having conversation B. And we don't always have time to stop and reflect on our language and what we're carrying with us, and whether we are, with our language, constructing the relationships that are really the relationships we aspire to. Because the frank reality is that relationships are constructed in language. We create who we are to each other in language. So that is a way of describing what I was thinking about when I thought of some ways for us to have a conversation today. And all of the conversations, the way I'm going to frame the conversations, are structured to give you possibilities for self-reflection as you go about the terrific work that you do. All of you are engaged with communities. All of you are doing the kinds of things we aspire to. All of us need supports. So the supports that we're going to be engaging in today are ideally ways of thinking when you have a chance to breathe about how is it going in terms of the construction of these social relations. So we'll talk a little bit about who we're serving. We'll talk about how our engagement is structured, the power of language a bit at the end, and space for a final reflection. And it will be dialogic throughout. And while I have a handful of things we might do, what we actually do will depend on the conversations you're having and what's beneficial to you. I am from a place with great big wide open spaces, which basically means that anywhere is far away from where you are right now. If you look at where I'm from on a map, it has the same population density as the desert in the middle of Saudi Arabia. But if you could see my lovely picture of grasslands, it's to give you a sense of, it gives me a backdrop from where I have come from. So I have an odd history, but that history includes doing work for the federal government in Canada in community development, doing contracts for community development. I worked for a consulting firm that did that kind of work. And I mentioned distance because it goes to different concepts of community when things are far away, where the nearest community of 10,000 people may be 200 miles away. It goes to how people think about who belongs and who's an outsider. And in the community work I've done, there are towns that if someone's lived in the town for 25 years only, they may still be an outsider. And there are towns that see anyone who comes into town as immediately being one of them. My work continued in a lot of work in education in highly diverse contexts, the kind of classrooms where there are 8, 10, 15 different home languages across a range of socioeconomic backgrounds. So my thinking about language is very much shaped around those experiences. What it has meant for me is that I'm constantly surprised. I remember doing some work with Theatre of the Oppressed in one classroom. This was part of a grant in which I was a minor player in some ways, and doing work with 9-year-olds with Theatre of the Oppressed, which is Boale, which is Paulo Freire, if any of you are familiar going into the South American work. But it's very much geared at helping people identify the resources that they bring. And the teacher had chosen a particular novel that involved a young boy being left with his grandmother because his mother had a new boyfriend and the boyfriend didn't want him around. And she thought that the young boy would be the point of identification. And early in the theater work we were doing around the novel, the children were asked to embody one of the characters and they could choose. And there was some work in terms of thinking through how you would embody. And so the expectation was that the children would be empathizing with the child who was roughly the same age as them. And we would gain some understanding of their points of empathy and some understanding of how they were experiencing the book. And so when they took on the position of the character, almost none of them picked the child. And we had 10 children of Chinese ancestry, 10 Chinese males of Chinese ancestry being the grandmother. And as all of us went at the end, or after watching this, was that many of these children came from homes that were multi-generational, where parents were working shift work, where they could go for days without ever seeing their parents, just because of the way that school worked and the shift work their parents worked and how many jobs they had to keep the family going. And the person who came to school to pick them up was their Chinese grandma. In fact, that's who filled the halls at the end of the school day, was the Chinese grandmas. And so we had 10-year-old boys hunched and gnarled and faltering in their movements and embodying who their grandmothers were. And the insight there for us is, of course, that we weren't making connections at all where we thought we were making connections, but we were making connections. We needed to rethink what that meant, though. I always remember being in a group of community members that included representatives of the Aboriginal community. And in this particular case, they were Cree. And talking about how one had become resourced to participate in the community. And there's all sorts of assumptions then about Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And one very lovely person spoke quietly about their faith and about the Catholic Church. Now, I wouldn't expect all of you to know the history of residential schools and about the injustices that have been perpetuated on the Aboriginal peoples in Canada. But all I could think of as I was listening, beyond the emotional impact of it, was how I would have been so capable of saying exactly the wrong thing if I had spoken, if the room had been in a different speaking order. Because the discourses of whom is oppressed whom, who is impressed whom, who is supported whom, where one draws strength from, I don't think any white person would go into a conversation expecting to hear a statement of faith in relation to the Catholic Church from someone who is of Aboriginal ancestry. And yet if one knows the history, the Jesuits in particular had been advocates for the Aboriginal peoples at different points in time. So what my background, the reason I mentioned my background, has shown me again and again and again is that I get it wrong. That the way I think I'm connecting may be not the way I'm connecting, even though a connection may be made, that the way that I plan for connections need to be more open to allow for possibilities. But I very much come into the space today as someone who has got it wrong, probably more often than has shown, which is one of the advantages sometimes of speaking last, is that one gets to change what one's going to do beforehand. And I'm hoping, therefore, that this conversation allows for us to talk about what we've done well and talk about where we're getting it right, but allows us to be comfortable in where we're not as certain and where we've gotten it wrong. And I'm offering up those two examples as indicators, both two different communities, different age groups, of where it's been very easy for me to get it wrong. I'm just going to give you the content of the slides because I don't want to restart Zoom. We're going to have you go into groups and have a series of discussions. And the first question I would like you to think about is, who do you serve? And so have a discussion about who you serve. Actually, first, I'd like you to take out a pen and paper, if you have one handy, or a crayon, or whatever, just whatever is handy. If you want to do it on your screen, you're welcome to. I'd like to give you 2 to 3 minutes. I'd like you to write who you serve. So just individually, something you don't have to share unless you want to. Take a couple of minutes and write an answer to the question of, who do you serve? And I'm going to be quiet now and allow you to do that. And I'll give you about 2 minutes. Okay, there's enough pens that have stopped moving. This is just to as a prompt. So now I'm going to have you go into groups. Anthony's going to move you into groups. And rather than talking about who you serve, I'd like you to think about the attributes or descriptors of who you serve. And I'd like you to mind map that. And that may involve identifying the group that you serve and putting that in the central and drawing things out, or you may want to sort of put who we serve in the center and then think about commonalities in terms of descriptors or attributes. There isn't a right way of doing this. What I would like to give you time to do, though, is to talk about who you serve, not as identifying the group, but in terms of descriptors and attributes. Last point, and one of the things about the Cree language that I learned is that every verb has both the action and reflection on action. So that's impossible to do in English. But it is why there is such a long wait time or a pause between speakers, because when one speaks or when one is listening, it is the ultimate insult if someone starts speaking immediately after, because it signals that they haven't been listening. It signals that they've been worrying what they're going to say next. And so there's always a pause between speakers, which is the engagement in the reflection on what has been said. And it's why the Aboriginal peoples can be silenced in groups, because the spacing is different in turn taking. I would encourage you to allow for a space when people are speaking. So the pause that allows you to reflect on their thoughts before connecting your own. Not a requirement. The Scots apparently have the least wait time. They overlap, but just something to think about, whether there's enough time between contributions to allow you to reflect on what others have said before you're bringing in your ideas to share with the group. So I thought we might just share a bit now that everyone's back in terms of what you were discussing. If it wasn't in the form of a mind map, I'm not particularly concerned, but what kinds of descriptors or attributes were coming up? Which ones were shared? What did you notice about what you were saying? Could I have someone from, let's see, great. I have many ways. I'm figuring out Zoom here. I can tell that you're all muted, but it's not showing me your names. It's just telling me that you're muted. There is someone who looks like they're wearing a black, yes, you're looking down and you have a black watch on. Could you speak for your group, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm guessing, hi Diane, I'm guessing you're talking about me.
Ah, yeah, well done.
I can't see anyone else, so apologies to anyone else wearing a black t-shirt. So we were talking about that all of us work with young people, and so two of us were from higher education backgrounds, and then one person was working more of like a community group. So and we use different terminology for how we define those young people that we work with, but like from a HE setting, we talk about young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and then if we're being really boring, we talk about OFS target groups, and then but when we're working with schools, they might have different language for how they talk about those young people, so like whether they're NEET or pupil premium, free school meals, and then we were also talking about how it's not just those young people that we serve, but also the schools that we work with, the educators, and our student ambassadors as well, who are like really closely involved in our work, and for one of the people in our group, the artists that they engage with in order to deliver their activities. So yeah, they're the kinds of things that we were talking about.
So it sounds like you spent a significant part of your time talking about the kinds of language that comes from policies, from administrators, from funders. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, of course, I don't know who is in which group. So
do you want me to say?
Sure. Let's pick on anyone you want from another group.
And Lucy from Breakout Group 1, if you want to chat for us.
Thanks, Anne. There was 3 of us in our group, and we all provide services in different areas. So I think that was really useful because we've got lots of different perspectives. But everything that was just said by the previous person, sorry, was it Hope? Sorry, I forgot to look at your name. So yeah, lots of similarities there. I went visual, and so did the other 2 people on the talk, and we were thinking about like a sand timer effect. So information and what is available at the top, and we are sort of at the neck, and then disseminating that information, that support to the people underneath. So it's taking all of the artists that provide the work or the experiences for people to access at the top, and then looking at how we can pass that on to the people that we serve. So parent carers, students, young people, the vulnerable in our community. We talked a little bit about that, about what we mean as vulnerable, because that's different for everybody. And it depends on what sector we're working in as well. So I think that was a really interesting point, is identifying what vulnerable actually means. So yeah, that's why we went a bit over, because we did a lot of really good talking. So thank you. I think that covers it.
Do you want to just add a bit about a sentence or two about what vulnerable means?
Okay. So I think it was Martin that mentioned the vulnerable people that he might come across in his area of work of supporting people. So vulnerable for him would be maybe international students that don't have any support networks, don't actually know anybody in the community. They might be vulnerable to mental health concerns because of that. Vulnerable financially, vulnerable. They might be not able to connect with anybody else outside of their own room, their bubble at the moment in particular. Vulnerable for me would be a parent carer who doesn't know what's available to them locally, or they've got a child with extremely complex needs. So that makes the whole family vulnerable. So it varies depending on what service you work in, I think, definitely. I could talk for hours about this, Diane.
It's interesting because it does sound like your descriptors were very linked to where you are positioned in the social relations of the people that you work with. And by work with, I mean where it's coming from as well as where it's going to. Would that be fair? Yeah,
definitely.
Okay. Maybe one more group and then we'll play some more.
Cool. Is Kirsty okay to speak from Breakout Room 2?
Yeah.
So we kind of spoke a little bit about the groups that we all worked with, and then we looked at the kind of attributes. So we've got a nice kind of variation of different universities and people we're working with. So we've gone through the kind of classic kind of the disadvantaged, all the kind of stuff that we have to say to kind of funding bodies and to Office for Students and stuff like that. But then we went more into the attributes and actually more of the positives of what we describe the young people as. So terms of like them being funny, kind of like their sense of humour, kind of their hunger and desire, and also kind of like that loyalty. So more of the qualities that they have. And Nick raised a really good point about one of the students he'd worked with, where actually sometimes you kind of say that negative descriptor first before saying the more positive one. And actually, you know, why not say someone's really good at maths before saying they're like an ex-offender and just stuff like that. So we talked a lot about reframing our descriptors and when we should use them. So we kind of got more into that tangent of things. But it was a really good conversation with Dawn and Nick.
Well, and as always in these things, that works perfectly for a transition. Because this goes to this idea of categories and classifications, and some of the loveliest work in this area that is still the most influential globally, although it's not always attributed anymore, was done in England in the 60s and 70s. And there was a fellow who was a German refugee in the 1930s and ended up teaching kids in the Isle of Dogs, or in the Docklands. And he ended up being head of Institute of Education. And the general consensus was that he would have been an absolutely horrible teacher because he went very esoteric in his explanations, but he didn't know what to do with these young men who had basically been, it probably wasn't called excluded at that point in time. So he used to have them take apart cars and put them back together again. Like he would literally sit and watch them take apart cars and put them back together again. And his academic career began with him reflecting on how quickly they could take apart a car and put it back together again, and the fact that he had no idea what they were doing. And that these were the young men who had been labeled as not, they couldn't learn, couldn't do anything. This was the group that had been absolutely written off. That's why he'd been given them. And yet clearly that wasn't the case, because they were capable of doing very complex tasks. And that didn't count. He did some phenomenal work in the 1960s with youth in the UK. And he did a very simple experiment, and he had kids classify food. And he just had food, and he worked with different socioeconomic groups. And the kids who were from what we would class as lower socioeconomic status would divide things by meal, what they would have for breakfast, what they'd have for tea, what they'd have for supper. And if you asked them to classify the food differently, they'd look at you like you were a bit crazy, because why would you classify it differently? This is how it worked. And if you asked middle class kids how to classify the food, they actually did exactly the same categories, the age group he was working with. But when he asked them to classify it again, they did fruit and vegetables and meat. And his point in doing that was that it wasn't about smarts, which is so often, or capabilities, which is so often how we talk about and label, but that it had to do with how people oriented to meaning. And these idea of vegetables and fruits and whatever had no meaning to the kids who were very focused on what they had for breakfast and whether there would be something to have at tea. These other meanings were not meaningful. And yet they were assessed as not capable of being academically able, because they didn't do what the middle class kids did. And so this idea of we must create categories. That's what a noun is a category. So we create categories when we speak, because if we don't, we can't speak. But that very often, these categories we create binaries of deficit and resourced. We don't even realize we're doing it, but that in the attributes, we are building up this picture of people who need and those who don't. And I'm focusing on the attributes for an important reason, and that is that any noun, any label can become pejorative. My own work has often involved individuals for whom English is an additional language. And the United States ties itself in knots, trying to find a term that doesn't have a deficit sense to it. And so in my lifetime in my field, they have changed how they label children 5 or 6 times. And so they'll say, this is the better way of referring to it. And all the research literature will move to that term just in time for a group of people to say, no, that has negative connotations. That's not what it is. And being in England, I actually can no longer keep up with what is politically correct to use. The point is that it doesn't matter in some ways what the label is, although it certainly does. It is that it can become a negative because of the attributes that are attached to it. And that the sense that others have of that label is colored by the attributes that we attach to it. And so you have the transformations that the last group was doing, moving from art, they aren't able to do this, to what they are able to do, what they can't do, to what they can, what they haven't got, to what they have, to what they don't do, to what they do, what they need, require, they lack. In our funding applications and our justifications for the work that we do, we tend to be over on the left side because that's the thing that gets us the resource to do something. At the same time, what that erases is what people can bring to the effort. And we can think also what that does to a relationship. If one person is the giver and one is the taker, and that's a permanent set of relations, or if we start thinking about what people bring in a sense of an obligation to what they're contributing to the success of what we're doing. And I would invite comment on that. You're welcome to pause first, but rather than go to a breakout, I'd invite comment on that. Does that resonate? Does it make sense? Do you have time to do that kind of thinking? Go for it.
So I look after a mentoring program at Sheffield Uni, and we do a lot of kind of work with the mentors in training about positive affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a ratio that we once got from kind of mentoring and defending foundation where it's kind of 7 positive comments for 1 negative comments, just to wipe the slate clean. So we always tell the mentors to just kind of overly be positive. And I think a lot of them do feel a bit sickened by it because it's not a natural thing to be like, thank you so much for coming. I've really been looking forward to seeing you this week, because it feels a little bit fake, I suppose. So we have to do a lot of work with mentors by always doing that within our training, saying lots of positive things. And I hope it sinks into them that it can just be normal and part of conversation, but definitely just to get those little smiles or that little confidence boost when you're going into a session, or even saying thank you at the end of a mentoring session, being like, oh, thanks so much, really enjoyed today, really looking forward to seeing you next week. It just makes someone feel really valued when you have got all these kind of negative things being said at you, maybe in class, like, oh, why couldn't you do this, or you've done this a bit wrong. And actually just get that confidence boost again can really change that person's kind of frame of mind.
Mm-hmm. And interesting, the ratio. Interesting, the ratio. Would someone else like that? And by the way, I've lost, by sharing my screen, I lose a bunch of functions. So Anthony is helping me in terms of when people are volunteering. And Anthony, I think your mic off.
I was clicking it, but it wasn't working. Yvonne and Dawn both have their hands up, little
Okay.
icons. So Yvonne, do you want to speak first?
Hi, yeah. So I think about this stuff a lot of the time because I am a disability careers and employment advisor now. Also, I have a master's degree in language and linguistics from Lancaster's department. So, you know, this stuff is of interest to me anyway. But coming back to disability, it's quite a complex area to navigate conceptually and linguistically if you want to be inclusive and to avoid a deficit model, because there are kind of two categories of disabled. There's hard fact impairments, and you do people a disservice if you act like they do not have an impairment. This doesn't include all disabilities, but you know, if somebody is 100% blind, then you cannot discuss their future career options without considering what adjustments they might need and what limitations they might face, or things that might be so difficult that it's not worth doing. But then, of course, you know, I work from a social model of disability, which is that the vast majority of the issues and barriers that people with disabilities face are created by the conditions that society produces. And what's been interesting is, since I moved into my role, I was the first ever disability careers advisor. The vast majority of students who seek out my service, they don't have to come to see me, they can go and see anybody in careers, but the ones who seek me out are very often the ones with the hidden disabilities. So, and particularly neurodivergent individuals, so autistic spectrum, ADHD, various specific learning difficulties, because they are truly disadvantaged by the way our society works, because it works on assumptions and ways of operating that they are constantly having to navigate as if they were foreign language speakers. So I think about this stuff a lot of the time. I also try really hard to avoid labels. So although I do tend to look at details of what their disability is before I first meet them, just to save, you know, me having to grill them for information, I allow them to self-define. Some are very, very invested in an identity as a disabled person and as of a specific sort, and that is part of who they are, and I need to respond to that. Some are wrestling with the thought about, are they actually disabled or not? And you know, there are legal protections that come with declaring and evidencing that one has a disability, but equally there are obviously issues for our personal identity. So I have to navigate all this, but thinking about this are, can't, haven't, have, don't, need, and who's the giver and who's the receiver, what I'm trying to work into my kind of linguistic construction of what I do is that I'm a resource that they have paid for, because they're university students, so they've paid the tuition fees and what have you, and therefore how do they want to draw on what I know? Because I can offer advice. There are fields of knowledge and insight that they cannot reasonably expect it to have that I have, so there has to be that relationship. But I'm trying to position myself as a resource, but also to say, well, sometimes you may have blind spots or things you've just never thought of that may be because I've encountered these situations before I can see, and I ask for their permission to kind of share my insights. But I'm really trying hard, being a good graduate of Lancaster's linguistics department, I am constantly seeking a dialogic relationship, and with some of them I tell them that we are co-constructing and that, you know, we're working together on this. And that's a privilege of working with a group who, regardless of disability, are linguistically able people and can deal with concepts. But that's what I'm trying to do. I'm really trying to move away from any sense of me being the magic person with the magic answers, while at the same time not ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the disadvantage, the structural disadvantage that they might face.
How's it going?
Well, I have different approaches depending which type of students I'm working with. For some, I can be it's advantageous to be very upfront about one's methodological basis. Others are overwhelmed by that. Second after the neurodivergent group are the mental health the students who are disabled with mental health conditions, very often anxiety, and I tend to go more for reassuring and a bit more parental with them, because that's kind of what they need to be in a safe space, whereas some of the others are quite happy to be in a framework and to co-create, you know, particularly the autistic ones. It's great because they just, you know, very straight about things, and I love that.
We've got
Sorry.
Dawn, Nick and Lucy who all have their hands up, and I'm just aware of time,
Yes.
Diane. What do you want to do? Do you want to let them all have a speak?
Do you want to just take a minute or two to contribute, and then we'll move along and I won't comment. How's that?
Cool, that's great. So Dawn, if you want to go next.
Thank you. This really interests me. It's something that I have been harping on about for many, many years. I think the use of language in our practice is really important. I think often those of us who work in these, as Diane called it, sort of meso roles, brokering roles between different groups, different communities, we act as interpreters, translators a lot of the time. And I know that the language that I would use when talking to perhaps fellow community developers, community practitioners, is often quite different to language that I use in a university setting. The language that I would use with my community colleagues perhaps tends to be a little bit more, to me, it's real. Whereas with academic colleagues, there's a lack of understanding sometimes of the nuances of what we're talking about. So, for example, just in the past month or two, I've had two separate senior management colleagues at the university, one of whom didn't understand the term third sector, so we had to explain that. That's something that I would use quite regularly. Another one was talking about a disadvantaged community, and this professor really didn't understand what I was talking about and said, Dawn, are you talking about poor people? I was quite taken aback. That's not language that I would use. I would never use that term, but it's the only way that he was able to understand what I was trying to talk about. And I reflect on this a lot, and I come from a language background. I also have a undergrad degree from Lancaster. I studied languages there many, many years ago, it feels like now. And I think being able to understand and use different languages is really beneficial in this type of work, because it helps us to articulate what we're trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great.
Thank
you. Nick.
Sorry, I was just doing the whole mute on mute thing. I think for me, it's that it's the challenge of ourselves as practitioners that, you know, when the language has become so pervasive and we've become so used to looking at the left-hand side, that when it actually starts to kind of unwittingly kind of change our methodology with young people and how we, you know, how we automatically reach for those left-hand side descriptors, and how does that then, you know, how does that change our practice and how effective we are? And kind of, I think there needs to be a bit of a hold and a mirror up to ourselves as our, you know, our role, you know, in kind of perpetuating and, you know, becoming instruments of oppression ourselves, and that kind of power we hold as that translator role. So, you know, as we sit between those two, the two areas of, you know, strategic management and community or whatever, you know, the way that we kind of use the language and the way that we interpret the language and translate it for different audiences, like how do we, you know, make sure that we challenge ourselves on that kind of almost self-appointed power, and how we've, you know, how we hold that power to you know, describe or make clear what the community needs, when, you know, that's not necessarily our information to give.
Thank you. And Lucy, finally.
I think she popped in the chat. She's had to take a phone call.
Right, yeah,
Right, yeah, phone call. Shall we move on, Diane?
Yes. You know, there are so many ways, just picking up on what Nick has said, that we are conditioned to take up the language that we don't want to take up. You know, even the idea that we're going to change or expand or improve and provide, and we would typically put those in the positive column. But depending on the circumstance, that may not be positive for some, that they're not looking for themselves to change, they're looking for someone else to change. That change is a threat, not a benefit. That the kinds of initiatives that we are drawn into in terms of making a difference may not be a difference that is, the difference isn't shaped in the way that those in the community would have shaped it if they had been participants in sketching out what was going to be available. So there are so many ways that we are drawn into this language, and I'm so conscious there's language that is used here that would be absolutely politically it's not just politically, it just would not be imaginable in some of the contexts. Working with students for whom English is an additional language, that coming here and I hear language coming out of my mouth and I think, well, I wouldn't even have been able to imagine myself saying that 10 years ago. And so that what we are drawn into because of the conversations which we are part of, which is very different than in the conversations that, you know, Yvonne talked, I think, you know, about being able to name the fact that you can't see as blind, and that's something that we need to work with. So this ways that, for all of you language people, that we are socialized through discourse, and then what that does in terms of how we start imagining these social relations. And there are different ways we can think about that. I'm going to do this slide in another one before I give you a bit more of a chance to talk. You know, there is power and hierarchy that we create in these things, within the of the co-constructing, depending of how it's structured. Who is the expert? Is expertise explicitly recognized in these dyadic or in intergroup relationships? There was a lovely bit, one of the projects I've been working with Nick, and Why Imagination Lancaster was on the first slide as well, that you didn't see, with connecting kids. And one of the heads commented on a very well-funded project 20 years ago and why she thinks the benefits didn't stick. And that's because it was really great work, but the obligation was on schools. And in placing the obligation on schools, there was no obligation on families. And so what they've done is created a relationship where the schools are responsible for kids coming to school on time. And in fact, she teaches the children of some of the children who were now parents who were in the program 20 years ago. And they just say, well, you're responsible for getting my kids to school on time. And so this idea that it's the supporting behavior and the way that those relations are structured in and of itself diminishes what others might contribute, what they might be responsible for, in ways that were well intended, but the legacy of the ways that responsibility and resources and the imagining of responsibility and resources, the way that those were structured. That's not in a research project that the 20-year effect was that people now expect the school to make their kids come to school on time. That's the kind of thing you find out from an expertise in the community. So how does that expertise become visible in terms of, for example, what we might be in the university in our connector roles? A long, long time ago, this is now 1994, in Works on Learning Communities, Sengi and his group talked about different ways of structuring relations that I still find helpful. And none of these are wrong, but they fit, they're useful for thinking as a heuristic in terms of what are we creating. There are times that we tell people what we're going to do, that this is a really terrific program, and this is how it's going to work, and this is how it's going to happen. And basically they can walk away, but that's, we're telling. Sometimes we're selling. It's like, I have a really terrific program and I want you to be involved. And for whatever reason, that's chosen to structure in that way. Testing, I would say, is what we did with Connecting Kids. Is we have a really terrific project and we want to try it out in the schools, and we'll hope you'll be involved in evaluating and giving us feedback. And relations become structured a different way. Consulting, where, you know, the difference between consulting and co-creating, I guess, is that you give away decision-making power with co-creating. With consulting, you're asking advice and you're getting feedback, and there's all kinds of things going on in the dialogue. But in the end, control is still with someone in the conversation, not diffused. And co-creating really involves giving it away, and giving it away then is giving away responsibility, not just decision-making power. You know, okay, we're going to co-create, so you have to do things. And that goes to an understanding then of what it means to be resourced, because if we're co-creating, then we are resourced. We individually are resourced as well as collectively are resourced. And so we have to figure out what we are going to do here and what our obligations are to each other for contributing to that. The process product dichotomy is always tricky because there's a deliverable. That's the way that accountability programs are structured. There's a deliverable. At the same time, we can deliver and ignore the learning and the change that is actually embedded in a process if a process is functioning well. So there's our language around this, the ways we understand those with whom we're working. May lead us to particular decisions about the ways in which we are working, which in turn shapes the ways that our endeavors impact, affect, shape those with whom we are working. And so the language comes in this way as well. I'd like to give you some time to talk about that in groups as well. And I'm going to make it relatively unstructured looking at the time. So perhaps come back at 10:55 and I will then just do some quick wrap up comments. But this thinking about how the ways that we attribute qualities to people also then impact how we design our relations with them in how we carry out our projects and the kinds of objectives that we might set for them. If I give you a bit of time to reflect on that in groups of 3. We were talking about the tensions, Anthony and I, in some of this, and I was pointing to the vertical axis, that required capacity for direction setting and learning. And this is very much a model of what kind of learning needs to be taking place in addition to for things to work this way. And who gets to learn and what kind of, who gets to learn what. So it's very much about learning, and the challenge with the kinds of groups that Anthony's working with in setting up something new, where it may be that if you're going to move towards co-creation, there's some things that people need to be resourced to be able to do co-creating, but in resourcing them, one may accidentally undermine their understanding of how they are already resourced, and that tension of both contributing to the development but never diminishing what people already bring to the space in setting things up. And the fellow who had kids taking apart cars and then putting them back together again has a very set of abstract theories about knowledge and learning. And 2 of his points were that, first of all, you have to recognize that what you know is relevant to the space. And secondly, you have to know what to do with that knowledge, because of course, to bring it into a new context, you have to work with it differently. And when I was working with phenomenal teachers, we were working with people considered to be master teachers. They got really frustrated with me and went, no, that's not right. And it was like, well, what? And finally, we got to the point where it was the master teachers understood that people didn't know their knowledge as knowledge. So it wasn't about recognizing their knowledge was relevant. The first step for them in working in highly diverse settings was to help people understand that their knowledge was knowledge. And then you could begin to work on understanding its relevance. And then you could begin to understand how to make your relevant knowledge relevant to others in that social setting. But as always, the people who are on the front lines are where the grain of sand is in the oyster. And so they were turning on the head a widely accepted theory that comes from a former head of the Institute of Education saying, no, there's another step in first supporting people in recognizing that they have resources, not simply inviting them in. But I want to just leave you with, I want to make you even more uncomfortable, and then you're welcome to stay as long as you like. There is a nice article that came out of MIT in the last couple of weeks that talked about those of us who are in these positions of making a difference, but also this general discourse that I would now, it was coming out of the US. It was very much framed in terms of Black Lives Matter, but I think it applies to EDI, as we're calling it here, and any other initiatives. And what it was looking at was this language of, in essence, of doing the right thing. And it made a couple of nice social behavioral experiments. One was that if people, and this is the most important, got feedback that they were moving in the right direction on these kinds of issues, their verbal behavior did not change. Their embodied behavior did. And what I mean by that is if people thought they were moving in the right direction in terms of equity and participation, they were less likely to go sit beside the Black person. Their gaze, in terms of inviting people to participate, my camera's here, but their gaze in terms of course, those kinds of gestures of welcoming someone to speak or noticing that someone might want to speak, their gaze started going back to those who were most like them. You know, we are most comfortable with those who are most like us. And it was in the nonverbal, which we all know is so critical to how we engage people, that essentially, if we think we're doing a good job, we begin to do things that undermine the good job we're doing. And so it's the old adage about the uncomfortable pew, the need to keep ourselves in that uncomfortable pew. When we're getting the language right, we may not be getting other things right. And in fact, getting the language right and getting praised for that may actually take us in directions that we aren't meaning to be taken. Not because we're bad people, but because there's a unconscious, that's really what unconscious bias is, so they strategically chose not to use that term. And so being a language person, and now there's more language people in this group, I know that, being language people, the danger of the language as well, in terms of how we start to construct ourselves and what we may not notice then about the ways in which we are engaging the world. So all sorts of incredibly difficult things to work through. But what these conversations are meant to be are opportunities to talk, to have a conversation, get to speak about these things that so often we don't, and then to maybe have ways of reflecting for ourselves when we are doing this kind of work of what our talk is doing, because others don't create the space for us to do that perhaps as often as we need.